In 1994, archaeologists excavating a cave in southwest England called Goes Cave found something that stopped the dig. Human bones, buried not arranged, scattered across the cave floor, in the same pattern as animal bones at a butchering site. Skulls had been carefully processed, the flesh had been removed with stone tools, the marrow had been extracted, and several of the bones had been worked into cups, bowls made from the top of human skulls, used by humans for drinking. Bones were 14,700 years old, and they were not an anomaly. In the decades since Goes Cave, researchers have identified evidence of deliberate human cannibalism. Sites across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Not starvation cannibalism, not desperation, something older and more deliberate than either of those explanations covers. A practice so widespread and so persistent across early human populations, researchers have had to stop asking whether it happened and start asking why it happened so consistently across cultures that never had any contact with each other. First thing to understand is that the word cannibalism covers several completely different behaviors that need to be separated. Any of this is going to make sense. Researchers currently identify at least 4 distinct types. Survival cannibalism, which is exactly what it sounds like, consuming the dead when the alternative is starvation. Ritual or mortuary cannibalism, consuming part of a deceased group member as part of a burial or mourning practice. Warfare cannibalism, consuming killed enemies as a statement of dominance or spiritual appropriation. And nutritional cannibalism as a deliberate food strategy, which is the rarest and most disputed category. The evidence at Goes Cave and most other European Paleolithic sites fits the mortuary category most closely. Processing of the bones is careful and consistent. The skulls converted to cups, here across multiple European sites spanning thousands of years. This was not improvised. It was practiced, had a method, and the method was specific enough to be transmitted across generations, which means it was not a response to emergency. It was a tradition. Here is where the evolutionary context becomes important. Researchers studying mortuary practices across ancient human populations found something that was initially counterintuitive. In groups where cannibalistic mortuary rites were practiced, the behavior appeared to serve a social bonding function. Consuming part of a deceased group member was, in many documented cases, an act of incorporation. You are not losing this person or taking them into yourself. They continue inside you. Several indigenous populations in which mortuary cannibalism has been historically documented explicitly describe the practice in these terms. The 4 people of Papua New Guinea, whose mortuary practices involving consumption of deceased relatives were documented in the mid-20th century, described eating the dead as an act of respect and love, not horror. Love. This does not make it less disturbing to a modern observer, but it changes what the behavior is. It is not predation. It is not indifference to human life. It is a specific solution to a specific problem every human group faces. What do you do with the dead? How do you manage grief? How do you maintain connection to people who are gone? Different cultures arrived at different answers. Some buried, some burned. Some left the body on a platform for sky burials. Some consumed. The method varied. The underlying need was identical. But here is the darker side that the mortuary framing does not fully cover. Because at a significant number of prehistoric sites, cannibalism is not mortuary. It is not reverent. It is not loving. It is warfare cannibalism. And the evidence for it is different in a way that matters. At a site called Herxheim in Germany, dating to approximately 7,000 years ago, archaeologists found the remains of at least 500 people, processed in the same way as animal bones at a butchering site. Not group members, not people buried with care, people who appear to have been brought to the site, killed and processed systematically. The scale and the organization of it suggests something closer to deliberate mass processing than to individual ritual. And Herxheim is not the only site of this type. Similar evidence has been found at sites in Croatia, France, and across the American Southwest. Warfare cannibalism, in documented historical cases, served a very specific psychological and symbolic purpose. Consuming a killed enemy was a statement about what that enemy was. Not a person deserving of burial, but someone whose death created an obligation, something whose resources, whose strength, whose spiritual power could be appropriated by the victor. In many cultures that practiced it, warfare cannibalism was specifically about transferring the power of the killed enemy into the body of the killer. You did not just defeat them, you absorbed them. Researchers studying the neurological and psychological mechanisms behind this find something uncomfortable. The logic of warfare cannibalism, however horrifying to contemporary sensibility, is internally consistent within the moral framework of groups that practiced it. The enemy is not in the same moral category as the group member. They are outside the circle of protection. That generates the prohibition against killing. And once outside that circle, the constraints that prevent you from treating a person as a resource no longer apply. Every atrocity in human history has used some version of this logic. Warfare cannibalism is just the most literal expression of it. What changed? Why does the overwhelming majority of humanity now observe. A prohibition against cannibalism so deep that most people find the subject physically repulsive. The answer appears to be partly biological and partly cultural. The biological part is a protein, specifically a prion protein, associated with a fatal neurological disease called kuru, which is transmitted by consuming human brain tissue. The four people of Papua New Guinea practiced mortuary cannibalism, including consumption of brain tissue, experienced epidemic levels of kuru, until the practice was stopped in the mid-20th century. Kuru is related to bovine spongiform encephalopathy, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and other prion diseases. Humans who regularly consumed human tissue were at significantly elevated risk of fatal neurological disease. Researchers have since found populations with long histories of cannibalism show higher frequencies of genetic variants that confer resistance to prion diseases. Bodies of populations that cannibalized adapted to the risk, but those variants exist because the risk was real. Selection pressure against the practice was biological as well as social. The cultural part is harder to pin down but equally real. As human groups grew larger and more complex, moral circle expanded. The distinction between group member and outsider became less absolute. Prohibitions that protected group members extended further outward, and the practices that were acceptable toward outsiders became increasingly constrained. Evolving moral frameworks that recognized something like universal human status. The prohibition against cannibalism is, in some ways, a measure of how far that circle has expanded. You are sitting here finding this topic disturbing, in a way your Paleolithic ancestor might not have. Not because you are different from them biologically, because the moral architecture you inherited is different. It was built on top of theirs, over thousands of years. Every culture that decided the circle needed to be bigger. The skull cups at Go's Cave were not made by monsters. They were made by humans, operating inside a moral framework that was genuinely different from the one you occupy now. And maybe that is the most unsettling thing the research has produced. Not that ancient humans ate their dead, but that they had reasons that made complete sense inside the world they lived in. Love that drove the four to consume their relatives. The power that drove a warrior to eat a killed enemy. The grief ritual that turned a skull into a cup at Go's Cave. None of these were random. None were mindless. All of them were answers to questions that humans still ask. What do we do with the dead? What do we do with loss? What do we do with an enemy we have defeated? The answers changed. Questions never did.